Yeah, it's just Pastor Dan messes up the service today. If you saw the little paper, it says, worship set number 2, offering. Release kids. That was the part I messed up. Okay. Enough personal things. Have you ever wondered how to make an impact in your world, but found that these things get in the way? I mean, have you ever really wanted to make an impact in your world where you said, I wish I could live a life that really made people sit up and take notice? I wish that I could, if I didn't have these things in my life, because these are usually the things that throw a wrench into all the good things we'd like to accomplish, right? All the things we dream of, all the things that we wish that God could pull off, all the things we just wish we could figure out how to do. Woody Allen made the statement years ago, which is often quoted, that 80% of life is just showing up. But I've noticed as I show up 80% of the time, it doesn't fix all the stuff. Because I show up and it still goes wrong. Case in point. But I wonder why we don't show up. What holds us back? Why do some people seem to transform the world around them and others, like me, sometimes rust away wishing we could or we would? What do you think about that? I wonder if we're afraid. Really, I wonder if we're afraid because we've been crushed, beaten down, abused, violated, criticized, wounded, that we are in pain because of circumstances of life that have hurt us. We're angry that things have worked out the way they did. That we're lonely and we don't have a place to go to talk about those things that we roll around on, but feel very isolated because we don't think anybody will listen, or if they did, that they really care to be part of our life. So we walk around with this stress and frustration. We can't concentrate. Panic attacks, I've had them. They're terrible. Have you ever had a panic attack where you kind of felt like the world was closing in and your heart started beating really fast and you got sweaty and you just weren't sure if you're going to survive? Raise your hand. Okay, if you look around, there are a few other people in the room that have felt that kind of queasy, it's just not going to come together for me feeling. All these things roll around in us. And that's the reality of it. Because we're human and life is messy. Now, if I could offer you a path to overcome these things, to live in a way that these things didn't affect you quite the same, would you be interested? If I could offer you a path that you could embrace all these things that are frustrating to you and be able to walk with a sense of hope or purpose or meaning, would you be interested? Now, that's an interesting question. Because we often say we'd like to, but when it comes to really, what is the phrase? If push comes to shove, we tend to back out. Usually because the price is too high. Usually because we don't see it's actually possible. Instead of believing it's possible, we talk ourselves out of it before we get there. But would you? Now would you think about it? Would you do it? Would you take action? Would you make changes? Would you shift your thinking? Because that's what I see here in Hebrews chapter, pretty much all of it. Because the writer to Hebrews keeps writing, saying the same thing. He says, change your thinking. Think about Jesus as if he's potentially able to do something in your life. And he starts off in chapter 1. He says, Jesus is the real thing. Listen to him. Last prophet, pay attention. Then he says, Jesus is better than angels. And angels are scary, big, crazy, authoritative. They're powerful, right? Jesus is so big over angels. The angels are like little small stuff. And Jesus is that awesome. And then we get to Jesus is more awesome than Moses, and Jesus is That's the whole essence of Hebrews. Jesus is incredible. We also see this idea that people tend to drift from Jesus. People in church tend to drift from Jesus. And we're warned about it in chapter 2. We're warned about it at the end of chapter 3. Middle of chapter 3, we're offered this rest, and we're warned again at the end of chapter 3 to be careful what you've put your mind on and choose today. If you're going to focus on Jesus, don't wait until forever. Think today, do it today. I think one of our problems when it comes to moving away from this list is the question of, does Jesus really work? Does Jesus really work? I agree, but I see this other thing. I think Paul wrote in Romans about how I see this law at work within me where I find myself bound by this old life and yet wanting to enter into this new life. And I think some of that hinges on, do we really believe Jesus works? You see, I think you'd be surprised if people in this room were honest about whether they think Jesus works. Now, I'm not saying whether you think Jesus is not good, or even that you think Jesus isn't a good theological idea. But when it comes to actually entrusting yourself to this idea that Jesus could take care of me, I think we would be surprised at the number of people who would say, yeah, I think it works, but I'm just not sure, because these things are really, really big in my life. And if Jesus were really real, I think he would fix this. And because he doesn't fix this stuff, I'm not sure. I think we would be surprised at some of the things we waffle on. Now, we shouldn't be surprised, because even Jesus' disciples asked the question. Even Jesus' disciples, they struggled with this idea of who Jesus was. And he kept bringing them back to, look at who I am. Look at how I treat people. Look at how I work. Believe what you can't see, and I'll show myself to be more real to you. See, I think the natural step is to fear. And when we're afraid, we drift to self-managed pieces that lead to burnout and anger and violence and withdrawal. But in this text, we see a different picture. See, in this text, the author of Hebrews paints a picture of Jesus and says, this is the Jesus that can overcome these things. He paints a picture that says, this is a great high priest that wants to take all of these things and do something with them, if we'll trust him. Now, there are really two essential pieces in this text. So we're going to read the text yet a third time, and then we're going to go into chapter 5. So if you have a Bible, follow along, starting in verse 14. Once again, therefore, anytime you see therefore, it's always connected to something above, and it's coming out of this warning about rest. Believe God. Believe that he wants to give you rest. Trust him. Give yourself to God that he would give you rest. That he sees inside all the secret parts. Listen to him when he speaks to you. Everything will be uncovered before God, and we're going to have to give an account. He says, because of all that stuff, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet was without sin. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Every high priest is selected from among men and is appointed to represent them in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. No one takes his honor upon himself. He must be called by God, just as Aaron was. So Christ also did not take upon himself the glory of becoming a high priest. But God said to him, "You are my son, today I have become your father." And he says in another place, "You are a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek," who was a priest that was referred to in the Old Testament. Verse 7, during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from what he had suffered. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek. Now we're going to stop. There are really two pieces of the puzzle that I'd like us to focus on today. Pieces that I think change how these things work. And they're both in verses 14 through 16. If you have a pen or you underline stuff, if you would underline or circle, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. And the second is in verse 16, let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. Let's start there. This word, let us hold firmly, is a very simple word that means hold on. So Emmanuel, come on up here a second. If you'd be so kind as to stand on this ledge here for me and face me, and I want you to hold on to my hand, and I want you to lean back for me. Okay. Now, we're holding in tension. Now, he's not sure he's going to trust me with this, okay, because he's not relaxed. He's just being careful not to give too much. But all we're doing, we're holding firm. We're holding firm. And he believes that I won't drop him, and I believe that I'll hopefully hold on to him. But all of the, oops, hold on. No, you came off. You came off because you were afraid I was going to let go. Okay. All of these things, all of these things on the board threaten to make us feel like we're going to go. And we're afraid we're going to go, and so instead of holding on tighter, what do? Well, we stand ourselves up straight. And the reason we do that is because we're anxious. Thank you, Emmanuel. That is the simple, basic word that this means. It means hold on. Now, in the context, the picture he's painting is a commitment. But the commitment has a practical picture. It's as if we're rock climbing. I know Becky Brown went rock climbing with her boys. And she climbed up like a 56-foot wall of stone. And she had on a harness, but she held onto the rope and she climbed, and she held and she climbed, and somebody else held her to make sure she didn't fall. That's the picture about how we live the best life. By holding on to Jesus as if Jesus is the rope that will pull us through all of these things. And see, that makes so much church sense until we start weighing in all the factors that could go wrong. And when the factors go wrong, what do? Well, we get anxious, and so instead of holding on to him, we hold on to our stuff. Because our stuff is stuff we can control. Instead of holding on to the Jesus we can't really see, but we have to believe, we hold on to all the stuff we can see and control, like we hold on to our finances and we get anxious about money. We hold on to our health and we go to doctors, and doctors are good and important. But we get so anxious about the God who holds us that we ignore him because we can touch all this other stuff. When we have pain issues because people have hurt us, we replay the story because we think we could have changed it. Now, granted, we could have, but it takes us away from the tone of this verse, which is, let us hold firmly. And if you look at what we're holding firmly to, it says, therefore, we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens. And what it's talking about there is he's died for our sins, and he has been brought back to earth, and he ascended into heavens. And we read in Acts where it talks about how the same Jesus that you saw and knew, the disciples, he was taken up before you, but he's coming back again. He raised up through the heavens. Jesus, Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. What is that faith? That faith is that Jesus has rescued us from sin. That faith is that Jesus is the voice of God for all of the things that are hard for us. That faith is believing that God sent Jesus as the answer to all of our heart's deepest troubles. Because if we're really honest, all these things get internalized. And they all make us wonder if God is still trustworthy. And when we wonder if God is trustworthy, we always turn away from Him to things we can feel and touch, because we think the feel and touch is the more real thing. But in this text, he's saying, don't do that. Look at verse 15. Why not? For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet without sin. Now, when it says tempted in every way, Jesus may not have lost a job. Okay? Jesus was young, so he may have had a lot of energy. Jesus may not have had panic attacks. I don't know. You know, Jesus may not have, he had certainly had people die around him. He might not have had any health issues. He certainly had sadness. You know, part of the thing that the writer was writing about in the Jewish church is they were under persecution. They were under times of stress and persecution. And part of that persecution, they were afraid. And Jesus, when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, wasn't he afraid? Didn't he pray, not my will, but thine be done? And if you look here in the beginning of chapter 5, it says in verse 7, during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. So he understood this fear thing. He understood what it was like to be terrified and yet trust God anyway. Now, this great high priest, anytime you're reading Scripture, you can always look and see what the Scriptures talk about, because the Scriptures actually explain this high priest thing. If you look there in chapter 4, verse 14, it says, therefore we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens. And in verse 1 of chapter 5, he says, every high priest. This is a reference back to the Old Testament sacrificial system, the priesthood, where Aaron was chosen as a priest. But God chose the high priest. And there was some discussion as to who that was going to be, and God says, no, it's Aaron. And in this story here, it tells us why the high priest is so important. It says, every high priest is selected among men, is appointed to represent them in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices. And the reason there was one high priest, and the reason he was human, is that he would be able to understand the problems of his fellow man and go before God and offer a sacrifice first for himself and then for people. So when he went in before God, he was a representation of all people. And it says he's able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. That the high priests that were appointed, that they went and they offered a sacrifice understanding humanity and all their struggles, but where God covered those sins, those struggles. And Jesus is the same, that he's not the high priest, he's the great high priest. And he went into heaven for us, and he intercedes there for us, and he was the last sacrifice for us. The only question is, do we want to hold on? Let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. The faith that Jesus is this high priest who was chosen by God, who learned obedience through his suffering and was made perfect, that he was matured and complete. That didn't mean that he was sinful. It just meant that he experienced all that he had to so that he could go to heaven and he could be God's representation for us. Hold firmly, as if I'm on the ledge and I'm reaching up and Jesus is reaching down to me. Hold firmly. Hold firmly. Don't let go of that promise. Don't let go of that trust, in spite of what we can't see, feel, or touch. Now, the second let us we see there is down a little further. And the second piece to changing how these things work is let us approach the throne of grace with confidence. Let us approach the throne of grace with confidence. This means exactly what you think it means. Let us go to God and ask for help with all these things. We all wonder, how does this relationship with God work? Well, we can picture this image when it says the throne of grace. And I've had pastor friends who have said, what images, when you read this verse, in verse 4:16, let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence. What image comes to mind for you? Like, do you picture God as someone that's far and away and remote and disinterested? Do you have all this stuff and you say to yourself, I can't really go to God because he's too busy for me? Do you say, well, God's probably worried about all these other things that are really terrible. My thing doesn't seem that terrible. This picture is that there's a throne and that God is on it. And he wants us to come into his presence, to enter in with boldness, as if he wants us to be there. As if he's inviting us to come and to ramble to him about all these things that are hard for us. And to say, God, I want to hold fast to Jesus, but these things are hard for me. I want to hold fast to Jesus as my high priest, but these things captivate me. And I can't get over them. And when I come to the throne of grace, and maybe I throw myself down at his feet, that he bows to me with a tenderness and affection. And he bows to me and he lifts me up and he says, my child, I'm so glad you came. I have been seeing you carry all these things. And I've so wanted to give you mercy. I've so wanted to remind you that I'm walking with you through every hardship. I know what it's like to be human, and I care about your struggles. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Months ago, after Amy's dad passed away, she stood right here and she talked about praying with shameless audacity out of Luke 11. And she said, pray anyway. She said, God works in the details of our lives, and God has already made a plan to get me through it. Pray anyway. Pray anyway. Come to the throne of grace boldly, believing that the God who's there is not disinterested, is not bored, is not on a vacation, is not deaf, is not hard of hearing, is not too preoccupied with other people's problems, but he is looking for us to come to him and come with shameless audacity as if to say, God, boom, I'm here and I got these problems. And I can't take it anymore. I just can't take it anymore. Please help me. Please show yourself real to me. Because it's that desperation that God seems to notice. Beloved, the writer to Hebrews wrote, wanting them to believe that God was more for them than they could ever dream, and that if they would appeal to Him for His supernatural help, He would. Now, this is where it gets kind of dicey. Because God does not do what I want Him to do on my timetable. This is where it gets kind of finicky. Because we say, okay, we're going to trust God, and I'm going to pray to God, and I'm going to pray really hard that these people don't die, and they die anyway. Okay? That is scary for our faith, to be honest. I prayed a lot that these people would not be sick and pass away. You prayed a lot that these people would not be sick and pass away. We believe God together, and God had other plans. So either God is a liar, and we just shouldn't believe anything He said, or He's more complex and has a bigger plan than what I can figure out, or I ought to be able to control God, and if I can't control Him, I don't want to trust Him. So what is it? I mean, either God is trustworthy and good, and He has things He figures out, or it's my job to control the world. These verses are saying trust Him because He's good. But He's not going to decide stuff that's going to make sense to us all the time. In fact, a lot of it isn't. And I think that's why later in Hebrews, he says, without faith, it's impossible to please God. And he says, now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we don't see. Because we don't see how it all works. We don't see how it all fits together. We don't see how it's going to end up good. Sometimes it's just confusing and messy and bad. And either we're going to internalize it and turn away from God, or we're going to go to the throne. Either we're going to internalize it and walk away, or we're going to go to the throne of grace. And if we go to the throne of grace, there's a promise that we'll get mercy, which might come in the form of kindness from others. It might come in the form of a song on the radio. It might come in the form of a check in the mail. It might come in the form of a verse that seems to like nudge you in a way that just makes you go, wow, I didn't realize God cared so much about me. Mercy. It might come in the laughter of a 2-year-old or a 4-year-old. It might come in a phone call you get out of the blue. Mercy and grace. Grace is goodness. It's kindness. It's tenderness and affection that comes to us not because we're great people, but just because. Just because. Almost like a puppy. The elders have been getting together for a while and building some relationships together. And a week or two ago, we had a meeting at the victim's house. And they have an 80-pound yellow golden retriever named Blake, whose head is this big. And he was upstairs during our visit. There were probably 8 or 9 of us. And they said, well, everybody's gone. You guys are still, do you care if we let Blake down? I was like, sure, I had a dog, and yeah, dogs are good. Well, this dog came down, and goodness gracious, that dog about knocked me over, not because he was like pawing me, but hey, Emmanuel, come on back up here. This dog was like this. Oh, hey, you're here. I'm so glad you're here. Oh, it's so good to see you here. Oh, my goodness. Oh, there's a person. I'm going to go over there. No, your hands are free. Goodness gracious. Come on. And this dog was incessant, like obnoxious, obsessant, but you couldn't believe, like, you can sit down now. Thank you for being my testimony. Seriously, like there's this, grace comes in all kinds of forms. And I think that God sometimes shows up in the most unlikely ways. And sometimes they're really small. But at some point we have to trust him. And trust always requires risk. And all I can say is in my life that I have seen God as trustworthy. And I've walked through these things, and I'm still walking through them. But this text about holding firm to the faith I profess that Jesus is trustworthy and Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, holding fast to that, and then coming to this throne of grace with abandon as if God has got to rescue me from my stuff. That has made the biggest difference in my life. And I'm here today to tell you that that is the thing that you need. That is what we need. We need to hold fast to Jesus as the gift that God has given us, and hold fast and come to the throne of grace with mercy, where we get mercy. You know, I don't know where you are today. I don't know which of these things is most overwhelming to you. But I know that God wants to draw near to you in a way that helps with some of these things. And God has not brought you here today so that you can think about this and walk out and ignore it. God has brought you here today because he loves you and he wants you to be part of this story. Now, I just don't know how. You know, for me, I guess what I want to end with is this. What on this board looks like your situation? What is it that causes you frustration or pain or loneliness or criticism? What is it that causes you stress or distraction? What is it that hurts you? And when you think about that thing, do you want to rest and trusting your trouble into the hands of the great high priest who loves you and wants to help you in your struggle? Or do you want to go alone? Do you want to entrust yourself to this God that in the scriptures sent his son because he loved us? Or do you want to just continue to self-manage? Because that's definitely an alternative. It definitely is. And you'll probably do all right, granted, but it's always going to fall short. It's always going to be not quite enough. And whatever fear you get around, there's always going to be yet one more. Somehow, all these things find their answer in the person of Jesus, how he comes into our life and how he helps us in our struggles. And what I want to ask is, if you're tired of struggling, would you like to put on Jesus for a while and walk with him and find out what it's like to live a life that's connected to Jesus more than it's connected to your problems? That is the big question. And as we close in song, if the Lord has prompted you to do something today, to entrust him in some way, I want to ask you to come and pray. If you want to pray by yourself, nobody will bother you, come on up to this side. If you want someone to pray with you, where you want to say, hey, this is my problem, I want you to pray with me for this specific problem, come up to this side. And if you just want someone to pray for you, they don't have to know your problem, you just want someone to pray for you, if you'll come and sit right here in the middle, we're just going to pause and worship team, you'll come and sing, and we can sing the last song, It Is Well. Today the message is God is real and he wants to help you with these things. The only question is, do you want help? Or do you want to carry it by yourself? Because the Lord wants to help you.